to get it done. I understand this caller's frustration. We are all frustrated beyond belief, but we can't let frustration guide our actions. We have to do this in a very smart, wise, sensible way.
Okay, the minority leader
for a posse, not a lynch mob.
All right, the minority leader and the majority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives, Richard Gephardt. Dick Armey, thanks for joining us on this day.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's go to CNN's Darren Kagan now in Atlanta for a check of the latest developments in America's new war. Darren?
Well, thank you very much. We want to go ahead and start with new information that has been revealed about the U.S. military's response to the 4 hijacked airliners last Tuesday. According to Vice President Dick Cheney, orders were given by President Bush to shoot down incoming commercial airliners over Washington immediately after the terrorist attacks took place in New York and at the Pentagon. However, no fighters were able to intercept those airliners before they crashed. Also, the Pakistani government on Monday will ask the Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden in 3 days or face massive military action led by American forces. U.S. officials do not expect the Taliban to cooperate on that one. In New York, Afghan ambassador to the UN, Ravon Farhadi, who represents the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, that is the anti-Taliban movement in Afghanistan, he said that today the Northern Alliance will make 15,000 troops available for any attack against Taliban-held Afghanistan. And we have a correction to tell you about from earlier. CNN showed what law enforcement sources who are working with the FBI had told us were pictures of some of the alleged hijackers. We are now told, however, that by the FBI that the picture we showed for alleged hijacker Abdulaziz Al-Omari was incorrect. The man we actually showed was Abdul Rahman Al-Omari, whom the FBI says is not under investigation for the hijackings. CNN, of course, sincerely apologizes for that mistake. We want to move on and give you more information about the story that is developing today over word we're getting from Vice President Cheney that President Bush on Tuesday had given orders that it was okay to shoot down a commercial airliner if indeed it did pose a threat. And let's bring in our Miles O'Brien, has more information on that. Miles.
Well, Darren, ever since that fateful morning, there's been a lot of speculation about the 4th and final aircraft that was hijacked, United Airlines Flight 93, which left Newark Airport bound for San Francisco. And this is a replay of FAA radar telemetry of that flight. It flew out pretty much on course, took a U-turn at Cleveland, so it went fairly far before the apparent hijacking occurred. And then, as we, of course, know, crashed into some rural country, a remote part of Pennsylvania. Now, the question was, it being the last flight of the 4, was there time for the U.S. military to intercept that flight with a fighter and be faced with the prospect of shooting it down for fear it was headed to, say, the U.S. Capitol or some other target in Washington? It was headed on a trajectory to the Washington area. Vice President Cheney on Meet the Press, the NBC program, had this to say just a little while ago.
The President made the decision on my recommendation as well, wholeheartedly concurred in the decision he made, that if the plane would not divert, if they wouldn't pay any attention to instructions to move away from the city, as a last resort, our pilots were authorized to take them out.
All right, now a couple of things to consider here. First of all, there were fighter jets in the air by the time this situation was occurring, so it is possible that the timing would be such that a fighter jet might have had that opportunity had that plane continued on. It is routine in the case of a hijacking for the FAA to notify NORAD to scramble fighters to try to intercept the plane, try to get the plane, force them down onto the ground. We were talking with General Wesley Clark just a little while ago about what the options would have been for that fighter. Obviously, an absolute last resort would be to squeeze the trigger. They would have tried perhaps to signal the plane down, try to force the plane down, and then ultimately, as a plane got nearer to the nation's capital, given what we've just heard, had the authorization to do what would have been a terrible, awful thing, and that would have been to squeeze the trigger and bring down a civilian airliner loaded with 35 passengers. Now, as we know, what happened, based on some conversations received by loved ones on the ground from passengers, what happened was the male passengers about this time here made the decision to attack the hijackers on the plane. They were told by their loved ones that the attacks had already occurred on the World Trade Center, in essence knew their fate, and apparently made the decision to attack the hijackers. We can only presume that there was a struggle which led to the crash there in Pennsylvania, thus taking the decision out of the hands of the U.S. military and perhaps an F-16 pilot. So that's just one more tidbit as to what was happening in the skies on that very fateful morning. Darren?
Well, and Miles brings up the question, as people around the country get on airliners again, is that something they have to face, the possibility that they too could be shot out of the sky if it turns out that they are on a jet that holds some kind of threat to something on the ground?
Just, add it to your list of worries here. I mean, that's one of the many things that we all have to contend with as we face the prospect of getting back on aircraft. And we do know this, and the Vice President was very pointed in saying this as well, that particularly over the nation's capital right now, there are fighter jets in the air at all times, so-called AWACS aircraft, airborne radar aircraft. So this statement was as much a little bit of history as it was, I think, a warning to would-be terrorists in the future, that not only is there the authorization potentially there, but the aircraft are already in the air.
All right, Miles O'Brien, thank you very much. Also want to talk about the call-up. We have been talking about the call-up of military reservists in recent days, thousands of them, about 35,000. But the question also comes into play, what about troops that are already in service, and what are the plans for them? Let's go to the Pentagon right now, and our Jamie McIntyre, who's standing by. Jamie, hello.
Good morning. Good afternoon. The message from the Pentagon is that the call-up of reservists right now is limited to protecting the United States, putting fighter planes in the air and watching what's going on in the skies, and assisting civil authorities in disaster relief in both New York and Washington. If the U.S. were to mount a major military operation, it would need to call up additional reserves. But listen very carefully what Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld says today, as he is trying to prepare Americans for a very different kind of war.
It is not a war that a military campaign deals with. It is a broad-based, sustained, we're talking about years, not weeks or days, and there are not armies, navies, and air forces to go after. They have no battleships. They have no aircraft carriers. These are people who operate in the shadows, and we have to deal with them in the shadows.
Same message from Secretary of State Colin Powell, of course, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, telling CNN's Wolf Blitzer just a short time ago that this is not necessarily going to be a major military campaign. He described it as primarily an intelligence war, a law enforcement war. Yes, there may be military action. It may even involve troops on the ground. Special operations forces are going to try to arrest or capture suspected terrorists. But what the United States is trying to, what the Pentagon is trying to prepare the U.S. public for is a long campaign against terrorists that will have a military aspect to it, but will be something that will go on for a long time, with the ultimate goal of making Americans feel more comfortable and less threatened by terrorists. And that is going to take years. And don't expect any necessarily quick military action. Darren?
And sounds unlike anything Americans have seen before this. Jamie, if you will, I want to go back to the report we were talking about with Miles O'Brien. Vice President Dick Cheney coming out today and saying that indeed on Tuesday, President Bush had given the okay, if needed, to shoot the commercial airline, United Airlines Flight 93, that was on its way from Newark to San Francisco, if need be, to shoot that commercial airline out of the sky. Anything you can add from the Pentagon angle?
Well, first of all, that would be obviously an option of absolute last resort. And what the U.S. is working on now is new procedures that would prevent the U.S. Air Force from ever getting into that situation of having to make that dreadful decision. One of the other real questions that's raised by the scrambling of jets and the alert that was given to the FAA is that whether or not there should have been some warning system to evacuate government buildings in Washington. Now, no one could have known that this jetliner was heading for the Pentagon, but it was known sometime before the event happened that the U.S. was under a terrorist attack. Certainly that was clear by the time the second jet hit the World Trade Center tower. It would take some very quick figuring, and this is all in hindsight, but if you were able to figure out that you were under a terrorist attack and you were able to evacuate government buildings in Washington, perhaps other buildings as well, there might have been some lowering of the death toll, but it's very hard to figure out. Same thing if you shoot down a plane. If you shoot down the plane that was heading for the Pentagon in this major Washington area, there are dozens of places it could have landed and caused even more casualties. So it's a very vexing problem.
A lot of tough choices. Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon. Jamie, thank you very much. We want to focus now on Afghanistan. The Taliban opposition there has also offered assistance in bringing in suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden. Northern Alliance officials tell us that Osama bin Laden has gone into hiding since Tuesday's attack. Whatever the U.S. response is, the Afghan opposition tells CNN it does want to play a part.
We are fighting the enemy of the world, which I mean Osama bin Laden. If the United States of America is about to show a reaction against terrorists and their collaborators, they should consult us and see what, how much effective our support in our cooperation would be.
Meanwhile, another part of the story from Afghanistan, word of a possible military strike against Afghanistan is sending thousands fleeing to the borders. Many residents have evacuated the capital city of Kabul. Our Nick Robertson is there. He has more on the reaction to the threatened U.S. action.
Bustling trade in Afghanistan's street markets belies an impending sense of isolation beginning to grip many Afghans. Concerns about the likelihood of an American attack and the possibility borders with Pakistan and Iran may close have driven food prices up 10 to 15%. Concern also Afghan people could become innocent victims. They should wait until it's clear Osama was involved, this vendor says. America shouldn't make any attack on Afghanistan, this trader says, because the Afghan people are not involved and not responsible. Many here, however, are too poor to flee the cities. 22 years of conflict has ruined infrastructure and economy alike. The years of war have also built up a resilience among many Afghans, to the point where a new attack would be a continuation of their ongoing battles. The result of Russian aggression was the breaking of Russia into 16 countries, this old man says, remembering the 1980s Soviet occupation. If America attacks us, Allah will divide America into 52 pieces. From influential tribal elders, not necessarily aligned with the Taliban, however, a call for diplomacy.
We advise the Taliban that they must discuss everything with everyone and not close the doors to negotiation.
However, the tribal elders also said if Afghanistan is attacked, they will back the Taliban to the end, a sentiment echoed on the streets here. As the last of the international aid workers began leaving because the Taliban said they could no longer guarantee their safety, Afghanistan's total isolation appears now closer than ever. Nick Robertson, CNN, Kabul, Afghanistan.
And before we throw it back to Wolf, we want to show you some pictures that we just got in within the last hour here at CNN. CNN having a chance today, and our Aaron Brown going along for the ride with the Coast Guard. You're going to see the first aerial view of the destruction at the World Trade Center. And while we look at these pictures quickly, the mayor, Rudy Giuliani, confirming 180 deaths in New York so far. 115 of those have been identified. The mayor, though, revising the number of missing at the World Trade Center upward to 5,097. He says the rescue operation will go on until all hope is lost. And as well as we toss it back to you, the mayor and the governor saying today that it is still very much considered a rescue operation.
Darren and I'll be speaking to Mayor Giuliani shortly. Later in this program, I'll also be speaking with the Pakistani ambassador to the United States. But joining us now are 5 members of the United States Senate. Here in Washington, Michigan Senator Carl Levin, he's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Virginia Senator John Warner, he's the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee. Indiana Senator Richard Lugar, he's a member of the Intelligence Committee. And from Boston, Massachusetts, Senator John Kerry, he's also a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. And in our Miami Bureau, Senator Bob Graham, he's the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. Senators, thanks to all of you for joining us. First of all, to you, Senator Lugar, what should the United States do right now?
2 things. The diplomacy that's been described is essential, not only Pakistan, but try to identify those interests that Russia, China, other nations have with us with regard to terrorism. That is going to have to be a long-term project, but the short-term aspects of it are obvious. The NATO declaration, obviously the work in Pakistan, but the trying to find how we get a network of support that is important if we're going to root it out. And secondly, in the Homeland Defense, not only the FBI investigations, but reorganization of our own government so that the National Guard units, our armed forces, the first providers, are in a network that clearly is not very well centralized or organized, despite a lot of discussion about that. These are essential to guard not only our airlines, but communications and financial situations.